Good on audio too for you? Okay, well, good morning to you. I'm so glad that you're joining us. We are continuing in our book overview study, and this morning we're going to be in the book of Proverbs, the book of Proverbs. And if you're carefully following along with us, you'll notice that we did Job last week, and that should put us on the book of Psalms. But we've already done the book of Psalms as an overview. And so I didn't want to take the time to do it again. If you're interested in that and you didn't join us last time we did the book of Psalms, then you can go ahead and go online on our YouTube channel, and in the playlist of book overviews, I've inserted the book of Psalms in that. So it's in the right order, and we're going to continue on to the book of Proverbs. Book of Proverbs. The book of Proverbs is an interesting book, and as far as doing an overview, it's kind of an interesting idea because they're all individualized. You can kind of do an outline. I don't even include an outline today other than to say that Solomon wrote the first 29 chapters, and then Agur did 30, and then Lemuel did 31. But other than that, I don't really give an outline. Some people kind of group them together with the first 9 are focused on wisdom. That's not entirely true. There's other things going on in there. So I didn't do an outline, but we'll just talk about the concept of wisdom this morning and the importance of the wisdom books. A proverb may be defined as, a proverb is a short, pithy saying in general use, stating a general truth or piece of advice. That's from the Oxford Dictionary. And this book is mostly written by David's son, Solomon. Remember, Solomon prayed for wisdom. He could have prayed for wealth and riches, but he prayed for wisdom. And so the Lord gave him wisdom and honored that prayer. Now, one thing that I want to also get across is that Solomon he did write 3,000 proverbs in his day. Now, keep in mind, a proverb is not a chapter of Proverbs. We tend to say Proverbs chapter 1, Proverbs chapter 2. That's how we talk. But a short parallelism is a proverb. And so Solomon wrote 3,000 of those. If you turn to 1 Kings chapter 4, let me show you where the Bible records this idea. 1 Kings chapter 4, let me show you this real quick and we'll move on. The Bible is stating how impressive Solomon was with his wisdom. In a moment, we'll talk about what is wisdom. What is wisdom? 1 Kings chapter 4 and verses 29 through 34, I'll show you this interesting background here. And God gave Solomon wisdom and exceedingly great understanding and largeness of heart like the sand of the seashore. Thus Solomon's wisdom excelled the wisdom of all men of the east and all wisdom of Egypt. And he was wiser than all men, than Ethan the Israelite, than Heman the Colcol, and Darda the sons of Mohal. His fame was in all the surrounding nations. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, and his songs were 1,005. He also spoke of trees and the cedars of trees of Lebanon, and even the hyssop of the springs of the wall. He spoke also of animals, of birds, of creeping things, and fish, and of men of all nations, from all the kings of the earth who had heard his wisdom, came to hear the wisdom of Solomon. And so here, I wanted to read this because not only does it tell you that he was a prolific writer and shared a lot of wise sayings known as a proverb, but he also was a prolific writer of songs. But I also wanted to draw your attention to verse 33 because it's showing these different figures of speech. Here we have in 1 Kings saying he also wrote about birds and of trees. And these are mentions of poetic form. You know, you are as the trees of Lebanon and so forth. And so here we have a listing of figures of speech that Solomon wrote. So it's kind of interesting when we're talking about Hebrew poetry. The book number is 20 out of 39. So we're working our way through the Old Testament. I almost discontinued saying the book number. I guess it's something that's like, oh, we're 20 of 39. But far more important than the book number, of course, there's 31 chapters. Far more important than book number, I think, is this. And well, I need to update that. That should say the poetic books. I'm sorry about that. That first part, the section is founded as the poetic books. I need to update that. But remember the pattern: 5-12, 5-5-12. This is the key to understanding the Old Testament breakdown. 512, 552. Now, what are we saying there? Remember, that's the number of books in each category. So 5 is the number of books in the Pentateuch, 5 volumes. Then we have the 12 as the number of the historical books. Stop there at Esther, and remember, you have the whole chronology of the Old Testament, from Genesis to Esther. The other 3, which is 5, 5, 12, you have your poetic books, major prophets, minor prophets. In those 3 categories are supplemental to the first 2. So the whole chronology is from Genesis to Esther. That's the whole timeline. Then the other 3 fit back into that timeline. In this case, we're reading it from the book of Proverbs, and these wisdom books are mostly written by Solomon, which will fit into the timeline of when David dies and Solomon takes over as king. So about 950 BC. So I like to say this. I like to say it this way. This begins, that is poetry, the 5 section, the first 5. This begins the first of 3 supplemental sections in the Old Testament. Poetry, major prophets, minor prophets. I've never quite heard it said like that, but the more we study, I'm like, that's a great way to say it, because these 3 sections then get plugged back into the first 2. If that concept makes sense to you, then you are ahead of the curve big time. Because most people I hear complain that the Old Testament's not written chronologically. In a way it is if you view Genesis through Esther as the whole story. And then these 3 sections are supplemental that plug back into those. If you view it that way, it is chronological. Hopefully that makes sense. And so in that sense, it is chronological. And that is why most pastors and teachers, do you see now why they see Gog and Magog is in our future? They don't realize that Ezekiel is prophesying the same time as Esther. But once you see that, because these last 3 sections may get plugged into the first 2 as supplemental, you can see the timelines there are quite easy once you understand how it goes. Of course, here's a visual of what we're talking about. That's the beginning and end of the story. These 3 sections then get plugged into here. So you're talking about the Proverbs of Solomon. We're talking about those getting plugged into when Solomon takes over for his father, David. When is that? It's about 950 BC. Just as a reminder, I'm just going to say this so we can remember. I'm not going to hammer this because we went over it last time. There's 3 kinds of parallelism in Hebrew poetry. I'm going to say it just to maybe get it in your long-term memory here. If it's synonymous, it's the second idea is similar to the first idea. So it repeats the idea. We gave examples of that last time. Antithetic means the second idea is in contrast to the first idea. This, but this. It's contrasting the first idea. Or synthetic, it just adds clarification to it. So as we're going through some of these Proverbs, keep that in mind. See if you can get good at looking at some of the Proverbs and recognizing whether it's 2 lines, 3 lines, or 4 lines. Remember, that's bicolon, tricolon, or quadricolon. Or is it one of these 3 kind of parallelisms? If you can categorize it, know if it's 2 lines, least amount of emotions. 3 lines, I'm ramping up emotions. I'm getting a little, if I'm on a theatrical stage, I'm getting a little louder. 4 lines, there's nowhere else to go. I'm at the height of emotions. And then 2, I'm taking a breath. I'm stepping back. I'm contemplating. I'm gathering myself. And now I'm restating my case with 2 lines. If you start reading the poetic books like that, it'll help you so much. It makes it come to life. And then are they doing synonymous? Are they repeating a similar idea? Is it antithetic in its parallelism? Is it contrasting the idea? Or is it synthetic and it's adding clarification? It just becomes fun to try and see if you can identify that. The general theme is wisdom. I really, the main thrust of me wanting to present this to you this way, I think, is because if you can get this general theme down, then I think you'll be very good at counseling, and you'll have a good head start in your life. And that is this. So we're talking about wisdom. Well, what is wisdom? I think wisdom can be understood in this. And this is going to sound so simplistic to you, but hang with me and let's really try to understand this together, because I think this is powerful. What is wisdom? Wisdom may be understood as the ability to know the proper goal of a situation and understand the correct steps to achieve that goal. You see, here is the issue. I'm going to go a little slower on this because this is what this whole thing's written about. You see, you have a lot of smart friends, or maybe you yourself are smart. You're an intellectual, and you look at other people and you're like, I can outthink them. Here's the issue. Wisdom is knowing how to understand the proper goal of a situation. If you start, we're going to go through a little deductive reasoning in a second. I'm going to give you an example of deductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning goes something like this. If point number one is true, we're going to go through like philosophy. If point number one is true, then that means that point number two must be true. And if point number two is true, then that means I know point number three is true. And if three is true, four is true, therefore four is true. This is called deductive reasoning. You're starting with a premise, and if this is true, then this must be true. Here's the issue. What I'm saying here is biblical wisdom, real wisdom, not intellect, but real wisdom is getting point number one correct. If you get point number one correct, then you can use deductive reasoning. Then intellect matters. But if point number one is wrong, you can have 50 IQ points higher than mine. You're going to be wrong in point number four. Does that make sense? So wisdom is knowing, it's the ability to know the proper goal of a situation, and then from there I can understand the proper steps to achieve the goal. See, I think a lot of people don't have wisdom in their life because they don't understand what the proper goal is of a situation. You know, some of the times when I counsel people, one of my favorite questions for people is this. I would say, what does success look like to you in this situation? Okay, because think about that. If we were all at a baseball game, let's use a baseball game. My beloved Mariners are not in the World Series because the Blue Jays are cheaters. I said it. It's on camera. And you can quote me. Well, they have one known cheater for real. But anyways, he was with Houston Astros last time. We won't talk about that. It doesn't matter. The Lord is allowing me to work through these grievous trials. I'm not bitter at all. But anyways, I've never cheered for the Dodgers in my entire life. But anyway, all right, moving on. Ken, stop. It's over. It's over. Okay. We only waited since 1977, but whatever. It is 1-1. Let's go Dodgers. I've never said those words before. I know Drew said, go Dodgers? And I'm like, I guess, yeah. Anyway, okay, moving on. What were we talking about? I really actually don't know. Wisdom. Let's see. The ability to know. Yeah, importance to know things. And then there was something else. Deductive reasoning. Yeah, I don't know what I'm talking about anymore. Point number one. Yeah. What was I talking about baseball for? Oh, wins. Recognizing a win. Here we go. Okay, yeah. Let's just say we were at a baseball game, and I took you to a Mariners game in Seattle, and you're enjoying it. We went to T-Mobile Field, and we're sitting there. Let's just say the whole stadium didn't know the rules. Let's say you were unfamiliar with baseball. Some of you are like, yeah, that's about where I'm at. Okay, let's just say nobody knew the rules, right? The fans didn't know the rules. And so let's just say it's the bottom of the ninth at T-Mobile, which means we're up. And there's 2 outs. The bases are loaded. We're down by 3, and Cal's up. And Cal hits a home run. Crushes it, upper deck. No one responds because nobody knows the rules. Nobody knows that the foul pole, that big yellow line going up, if it goes just to the right of that in right field, then it's a foul ball. It counts for nothing. It counts for a strike. If you have 2 strikes, it counts for nothing. If it's to the left of that, he wins the game, and it's the most incredible thing ever. But the fans don't know that. He crushes a homer, and everybody just sits there. It's total silence. Why? Because they don't know the rules of the game. They can't recognize a win. Does that make sense? Or even worse, what if the fans all thought the rules were different? You'd have pockets of people celebrating, and other pockets of people would be indifferent, and others might even be annoyed at them yelling. See, I'm talking right now how to run a church. I'm talking right now how to run your family. Could you imagine in our ministry here if we didn't know what a win looks like? But we know what a win looks like. We know what the Lord's calling us to do here uniquely. So we can celebrate things that other churches may not celebrate because he's called us to do things a certain way. Just like that, you need to know what is a win in your house. What is a win? Are you experiencing success in your house, but you don't recognize it because you don't know the rules of your house? Or is the Lord allowing you to succeed personally, but you don't recognize it because you don't recognize what a good goal is? Wisdom may be understood as the ability to know the proper goal of a situation and understand the correct steps to achieve that goal. A wise person that has the wisdom of God seems to almost know and be able to predict the future, not because there's some, fortune teller, but because they understand deductive reasoning. If you do this action, odds are this will happen. And if this happens, odds are this is going to happen. Therefore, don't do that action. This will lead to that. This will lead to that. Don't do that. You're in 5 to 10 years, you're going to end up like that. I used to tell teenagers this all the time when I was a youth pastor, but it counts for adults too. You want to know where you're going to be in 5 years? Here's where it is. The people you hang out with and the books you read. That's you in 5 years. Guaranteed. So you can actually determine your own course, get better friends, read better books. What information am I letting into me? Wisdom is the ability to know those things. Let's go on. If one begins with the wrong end goal, in other words, point number 1, then their steps may be sound. I think it's a really important point because you have friends at work that are smart and they get things right because they're sound thinkers. What's the problem? They may not have the first part right. If you get the first part right, you can be 100% correct on parts 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 of your plan, but you're being successful in a bad plan. Man, you nailed it. And now what? Now you did it. Now what? You were wrong to begin with, and you successfully succeeded at having a wrong premise. Deductive reasoning is useless if one starting point is flawed. Let me give you an example. Here's the example. Money is the source of true joy. That's my premise. Now, just so you don't get confused at where Ken Mady's at, I put in the parentheses, error. Okay? But that's a premise a lot of people have. So we're going to start with that. Number 1, deductive reasoning. My premise is money is the source of true joy. If that's true, then my intellect is now going to be correct. Points 2, 3, and 4 are all correct if 1 is correct. Money is the source of true joy. So therefore, 2, to obtain true joy, one must gather as much money as possible. Isn't that true if point number 1 is true? Of course it is. And if it's true that I must obtain true joy, I must gather as much money as possible, then it must be true that the pursuit of money is the pursuit of true joy. Has to. And if that's true, then it must be true that the love of money is the root of all joy. Has to be true, except for one problem. My premise is wrong. In fact, it's so wrong, if you would, you know this, so I'll just say it because you know it. 1 Timothy 6:10, what does it say? It says, for the love of money is the root of all evil. But my premise was money is the source of true joy. I am correct in 2, 3, and 4. I'm an intellectual and figured out the proper steps of 2, 3, and 4. I can defend 2, 3, and 4 based on the authority of point 1. What's the problem with it? Point 1 is wrong. So wisdom in the Bible has the ability in any situation that I'm in, whether it's waking up on Monday knowing how to use my time the best, or I'm counseling somebody on a relationship, or we're talking about long-term finances, or we're talking about how to lead an organization. Wisdom is the ability to have God's mind on the end goal, and then based on the end goal, have the ability to know how to take proper steps in my deductive reasoning. And that's why you have super smart, ungodly friends that get most of their life right and are miserable. Our reasoning must start with the Lord before logical steps will produce correct results. Look at Proverbs 1:7. See, without this understanding, I think a lot of times what Christians do is a lot of Christians say, well, the world is just foolish. And then you get out in the world, you're like, actually, there's some really smart people. But this unlocks that for you. They can still be smart. They can have an intellect and still have the wrong goal. This tells you why. This unlocks that mystery. Solomon says in Proverbs 1:7, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. You see the two parallels? That but is a contrast, isn't it? So you know what kind of parallel it is. It's a two-line, it's a bicolon, and it's a contrast. But wait a second, you say, Ken, what does this mean to fear the Lord? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. So let me explain this. I see this in the same way as I would see traffic outside, or maybe a train. I love trains. Growing up in Seattle, there were trains. I could hear trains if you were just quiet enough at night and your house was quiet enough and all the windows were open. You could hear in the distance train horns. In fact, when you watch a Mariners game, one of the things you can hear in the distance is those exact same trains that I heard when I was a little boy, because the stadium was right across the water from us. So when I hear those trains, I'm like, oh, my poor family thinks I'm such a weirdo, but I'll turn it up when we're watching it on TV. Oh, I mean, they can hear the train in the background. There it is, there's that train. We had a series of just massive train tracks. When you cross the train tracks in Seattle, you're jumping over like 50 sets, and they can go that way and this way and straight and all that kind of stuff. I'm not scared of trains. I have a fear of trains if I have a bad relationship with a train. I like looking at a train. I don't want to be stuck on the tracks when the train's coming at me. Think about it in traffic. Are you scared of traffic? You're like, well, it depends. The turnpike, maybe. But if you're in the right relationship with traffic, you don't have anything to be scared of. But if you're going the wrong way on the turnpike, you're not in a right relationship with traffic. That's how we're to view the Lord. His awesome power is a benefit to those that are in a right relationship. But if you're contrary to him, you're going to be ground to powder, as Jesus said in Matthew 21. Therefore, understanding that concept of having a right relationship with a train or the traffic, if you view it that way of the Lord, that is the fear of the Lord. He's a benefit if you're in a right relationship with him. But if you're in a contrary relationship to him, you should be terrified and you'll be ground to powder. That's the fear of the Lord. That's the beginning of knowledge. And so you can have now point number one correct. Your deductive reasoning begins there. And if that understanding is there as your foundation for money, relationships, anything you can kind of put into that category of that, those relationships which produce emotions, has to start with the premise of, Lord, am I in the flow of what you want to happen in my life, or am I contrary to you right now? If I'm in the flow of it, then my point number one will be sound. And if point number one is sound, then the wisdom of God will almost allow you to, and I don't mean this in a mystical way, but almost allow you to predict the future. Because if this happens, then this happens. And I mean, Sarah and I talk about it all the time. I'm like, because of this thing this person did, unless the Lord intervenes and they can repent in a serious way, this is what's going to happen. So, Sarah, what we're going to do is we're going to do this because we're not going to be there for that. Wisdom. Wisdom. What's the scarlet thread in the book of Proverbs? Well, turn, if you would, to Matthew chapter 12. Jesus is directly compared to Solomon. The Bible says that we have a Hebrew idiom for Solomon. I don't have it in your notes, but there's a Hebrew idiom for Solomon, and it says something like this, that Solomon is the wisest king who'd ever lived. He's the best king that ever lived. And it even goes on to say, there's never been a king like Solomon, and there will never be a king like Solomon in the future. There never will be again. That's an idiom. It's a hyperbole. It's not literal. Why do we know that? Because in Matthew chapter 12, it's the same sort of thing that you read about in Matthew 24 when we read about the great tribulation, that there's never been one like it, never been a time like it, no, nor ever shall be. When you don't understand these are Hebrew idioms, you get trapped in literal readings. Matthew chapter 12, and look at verse 39. But he answered, and he said to them, Jesus is describing this to the scribes and Pharisees, an evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. How many people today are seeking after a sign? Oh, it's a sign. I mean, when Russia invaded Ukraine, it's a sign. What does our Lord say about that? An evil and adulterous generation seeks after a sign. Be careful about those signs, guys. He says, no sign will be given to it except the sign of the prophet Jonah. He's talking about himself being dead and resurrecting 3 days later. It's kind of like what the author of Hebrews says in Hebrews chapter 1. In these last days, God has spoken unto us by his Son. It was through the prophets, it was through the patriarchs, and now it's through Jesus. You say, Ken, where do you take your marching orders from? Jesus. Everything, all the principles I lived through my life, I should be able to trace back to Jesus. You say, oh, you don't listen to the Apostle Paul or Peter or Jim. No. Jesus told me to listen to them. He commissioned them in Luke 24. They represent his ministry. I am listening to Jesus, and he told me that he commissioned the apostles to be his representatives. So the things that they say about him are true. I am listening to Jesus. It says, don't seek after a sign except for the sign of Jonah, verse 40. But as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the great fish, so will the Son of Man be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. 41. And the men of Nineveh will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, because they repented at the preaching of Jonah. And indeed, a greater than Jonah is here. Isn't that amazing? 42, the queen of the south will rise up in judgment with this generation and condemn it, for she came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and indeed a greater than Solomon is here. Okay, let's take this one step further. A greater than Solomon is here. But I want you to see this, that I believe that the wisdom, as Solomon wrote about wisdom, the wisdom he's writing about was, please get this, I think this is pretty powerful, the wisdom in which Solomon was writing about in the book of Proverbs was made manifest in the person of Jesus. So when we're reading about wisdom in the book of Proverbs, we're reading about Jesus. Let me show you that. It was a prefiguring of what Jesus would embody. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1. 1 Corinthians chapter 1. Jesus is the wisdom of God. 1 Corinthians chapter 1 and verse number 30. Paul writes to the church at Corinth, trying to help them with their messed up way of thinking and their divisions. But of him you are in Christ Jesus, who became for us wisdom from God, and righteousness and sanctification and redemption. That is written, he who glories, let him glory in the Lord. Also look over, if you would, in Colossians chapter 2, just to your right. Colossians chapter 2. Philippians, Colossians. Oh, God eats. Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians. God eats pie crust. There, that's how I always say. What did I say? Colossians chapter 2. In Colossians chapter 2 and verse 3, says, in whom are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and of knowledge. Wisdom is personified in Proverbs chapter 8. We'll end there. Let's just go ahead and turn to Proverbs chapter 8. Wisdom is personified in Proverbs 8. Wisdom states that she was present at the creation of the world. Let me show you. This is pretty neat. So Solomon writes this proverb, this series of proverbs in Proverbs 8, and he allows wisdom to be the guest in Proverbs 8. It's very fascinating. Let me just start at the beginning here in verse 1, Proverbs 8:1. Does not wisdom cry out, Solomon writes, and understanding lift up her voice? She takes her stand on the top of the high hill beside the way where the paths meet. She cries out by the gates and the entry of the city at the entrance of the doors. To you, O men, I call. So now wisdom is speaking in verse 4. Okay. Okay. To you, O men, I call, and my voice is the sons of men. You, O simple ones, understand prudence, and you fools, be of an understanding heart. But look, if you would, in verses 22 and 23. The Lord possessed me, remember, wisdom is speaking. The Lord possessed me at the beginning of his way, before his works of old. I have been established from everlasting, from the beginning, before there ever was an earth. And so here wisdom is speaking and saying, at the creation of the world, I was there. God used me before the creation of the world. Wisdom is speaking. And then we learn that Jesus is the embodiment of wisdom. He is the wisdom of God. So in this sense, you also have this incredible idea of Solomon speaking of Jesus. One last thing, I forgot about this, and I have to show you this. Go to 30. This is the words of Agur, and in verse 30, look at what he says here. He says, the words of Agur, the son of Jacob, his utterance. This man declared to Ithiel, to Ucal, surely I am more stupid than any man, and do not have the understanding of a man. He says this in verse 2. Verse 3, I neither learned wisdom nor have knowledge of the Holy One. So in verses 2 and 3, you can read those through a couple times. What he's saying, I am humble, fine, don't give me any ability to have intellect, fine, I am the dumbest person you ever met, fine, that's me. In and of myself, I have no wisdom. But then he says in verse number 4 of this, he says, but let me ask you a question. Who has ascended into heaven or descended? So what's the answer? God's the only one that fits that. Who has gathered the wind in his fists? He says in verse 4. It's kind of like Forrest, right? Forrest, I may not be a smart man. That's kind of what he's saying here. But I do know who gathers the winds in his fists. That's kind of how he's wording this. But read on. He says, who's bound the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? Now look at this. What is his name? But check this out in Proverbs 30. And what is his son's name? If you know. Did you know that was in Proverbs 30? So Proverbs 30, the idea of God being the only one that can do all these things. He has a son. I wonder what the rabbis would say about that. I'm sure they would say he's talking about somebody else. But all right, let's go ahead and move on. But this is the book of Proverbs. I love the book of Proverbs. Wisdom is essential. It's crucial. To have the Lord as our starting point for deductive reasoning is absolutely critical if your life is going to count for Christ and you'll have the proper steps of intellect in figuring out life. So hopefully that's been a blessing to you.